Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Tuesday Treasure program, where we go through some of the lesser seen objects in our collections. My name, as always, is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. As always, we bring you our Tuesday Treasure for free, but we do appreciate any donations, any support that you can give us during this difficult time. As you may know, we are not funded by the town of Westport, other than grants and things that we go for. So we do appreciate any way that you can support us. This also includes going on to our social medias and following us there. There's lots of good stuff there. You'll also be notified of our next Tuesday Treasure, which will be held in December or January. So tune in for that. So today we are going through some of the items that are connected to leisure. At the moment, the museum is hosting our Playful Pastimes exhibit, which is all about how people spent their free time between 1890 and 1910. So we'd like to go through some of those objects that are actually in the exhibit most of the time, but also some bonus objects, also some pieces that are actually not from that period, which will actually take us to our very first object. So here on the table, you'll actually see that there are a couple of different items. Many of you may recognize these pads and a helmet and this bag as all belonging to a football uniform. This uniform is from 1983, and this actually belonged to a very famous Westporter, Mr. Paul Newman. Actually, if it may be difficult to read, and I apologize, maybe we will post an image on our Instagram if you follow us. On this helmet, you'll actually see down here is the very, very, very light name of Paul Newman. You can actually see the end of his name there. These are also his kind of shoulder pads as well as his pants. They have removable pads here, so you can actually see a bit of the padding of the football uniform itself. It has these foam, very, very dense foam pads, and then it has some of this kind of wool batting around it to give some comfort. But it looks very different from the uniforms that we see today. Obviously, underneath a modern football uniform, there are many pads and many layers of protection. But during this period and even earlier, football uniforms were not standardized, not the way that the NFL and the WNFL and many other organizations function today. But the main protection was up to the player. So this football uniform was used in high school for Mr. Newman. Actually, if we take a look here at this bag, you can actually see his name quite well, Paul Newman, with his address in Ohio. This was donated to the museum in 1994 by Paul Newman and his wife, Joanne Woodward. And this is a part of a larger donation that the couple gave us, gave the museum, in the 90s, including many fine dresses and other relics of the Newmans, including some stuffed animals that maybe we'll get into in a later date. But I draw attention to the football uniform to talk about the way that it has changed. So this is from the 80s, again, a high school uniform. But if we take a look at this piece back here, you'll be able to read the word owls very, very clearly. This item was donated to the museum in 1988 by Mr. Willard Williams. Mr. Williams played for the Owls football team here in Westport in the 1920s. This is actually one of the objects that is usually on display in our exhibition. And what we talk about there is that difference in protection. Again, that protective layer was up to the players. This sweater was owned by Mr. Williams, but many of the pictures of the team actually show different sweaters. Different players are wearing different levels of padding and different helmets and things like that. Mr. Williams, while he was on the Owls team, played games at the Hillendale Road lot, as well as the Kioski lot on Post and Greens Farms Road. Williams himself was also a noted sports writer and a longtime editor at the Norwalk Hour before retiring. He also worked at the Westport Standard, the Westport Herald, and the South Norwalk Sentinel. Williams also served as the third selectman in Westport, and he was a Knight of Columbus. Interestingly, he also served as the chief of air raid wardens here in Westport in World War II. In one of our past Tuesday Treasures, we did show one of the air warden maps and kind of pamphlets that they actually trained local citizens to be spotters for enemy airplanes during World War II, as well as how to evacuate an area in case planes were ever spotted. So this one man had quite the life. But going back to the Owls for a moment, this team was here in Westport during the 20s. They won a championship. They were also a semi-professional football team, meaning that their players were paid. There were tickets to go to games, but don't get any high hopes of kind of NFL levels of fame. It was definitely a subsidy. It was not a very large amount of money, but something that the team could purchase pieces like their sweaters. And believe it or not, this sweater is a piece of protective gear. One thing that we discuss in our exhibition is these sweaters would have been worn over top of certain padding, like we saw from Mr. Newman, but it would have been more minimal. It was hard leather and pieces around the shoulders, around the tops of the thighs, like pieces that we see here, just on the top. But often players were not heavily padded. They were not wearing, especially helmets, the way that we think of them today. If we actually go back to Mr. Newman's helmet for a moment, you'll see there are flaps here, but in the front, there is no protective caging in the way that we see on modern helmets. Especially if we go back to the 20s, helmets looked very similar to this, but they weren't even as hard. And their main purpose was actually to protect the ears rather than kind of protecting the head and the neck. We think about concussions today, but the main concern back in the 20s and even earlier was injury to the ear and to the ear canals. So be thankful that modern players do have an extra added layer of protection in some of the uniforms that they're wearing. The other piece that I have here on the table, this is a women's piece of clothing that they're wearing during some of the leisure activities that they're taking part in. If you read very closely up here at the top, you'll see number 7161. This is a pattern. This is a paper pattern to make, I know it's very small, but again, check out our Instagram for a close-up, a ladies or girls gymnastic costume with bloomers included. So this image up here is showing you the piece of clothing that was being advertised. This particular pattern is from 1898, and this was meant to be worn by ladies, as it mentions, or young women or girls, while they were performing things like gymnastics. Probably not the gymnastics that we're used to today, not something like we would see Simone Biles performing, but tumbling passes, kind of rhythmic dance, and those types of acrobatics would have been something that this pattern was recommended for. I have a few other items here that I'd like to show you as well. One of them, I'm sure that many of you recognize probably what it is. In the very, very back, this highest mannequin that we have here, this is a bathing costume. This bathing costume, excuse me, is roughly from about the 1920s. It might be just a tad earlier. And this, again, differs quite a bit from what we see at the beach today. Many bathing costumes at the turn of the 20th century were in a dark material or a dark color because they were relatively thin. Many of the earliest bathing costumes were made of wool, Our costume here is made of a wool-cotton blend, but this is very, very light. I should say, not necessarily weight-wise, but the material is very thin. And if you wore a bathing suit of a fine white, it might be considered very immodest. So many times they were made in a dark clothing. And this was the same for men as well. The piece that we're looking at here is meant for a woman. It would have been worn with stockings, also of a dark color. And it was meant for bathing. Now, today we think of a swimsuit to actually go swimming, to go fully into the water and maybe do some laps or splash around. But this costume was not meant for swimming, for active swimming. This was meant for, as I mentioned, bathing. And what that means is going into relatively shallow water, what we would consider wading, and maybe kneeling down, maybe submerging up to the shoulders, but not this very active activity of actually going into a body of water or a swimming pool and doing laps and kind of rigorous activity. It was meant for a more leisurely kind of swim and enjoying the water. This, of course, changes quite rapidly into the 30s and 40s, and then into the 50s and 60s. Obviously, the bikini begins to be introduced, and swimwear changes quite dramatically. But the two other pieces, the final pieces that I have to show you, I think we'll do this one here on the side first. This is a riding suit. This was donated to the museum in 1982. And this is a ladies' suit, as I mentioned. It is two pieces, a jacket and a skirt. And this is literally a riding suit meant for horseback riding or for motoring, perhaps. You can see it is made of a very similar wool material as the bathing suit. I will say it is a thicker material, far, far thicker than the bathing suit. It is much more structured. And the purpose of a riding or a motoring outfit was to allow for more movement. We can't see the bottom of the skirt very well today, but if you see it in person, it is cut and actually sewn in a way that it uses multiple panels to allow for freer movement around the feet. It is a full skirt, but it is also slightly shortened from what we would consider a gown or a kind of evening skirt. And this allows for easier movement. Obviously, if you are riding a horse or operating a car in the 1920s, you wanted that movement. It is still very structured. You can see that in the jacket. It is very crisp. The lapels lay nice and flat. It's also interesting that in this time period, we're again talking about the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. This is a time when women's fashion is very much taking note of men's fashion, especially military uniforms. As you go into World War I, many of the fashions that women are taking on is supporting the war effort in a visual way. And we see that very much in this riding suit. Now, the last piece that I'll show you today, before we sign off, is this dress here. This dress was donated to the museum in 1982. Excuse me, I misspoke. The riding suit was donated in 1997. This dress here was donated in 1982. I apologize for that. But this dress here, again, roughly 1900. This is a lawn dress, sometimes known as a lingerie dress. And it is very, very fine. Now, when we think about leisure, we're thinking about sports and activities that people are engaging in. But another thing that people are engaging in is just enjoying the free time, enjoying the outdoors for the first time, in very large amounts of time for the first time. And when we think of a summer dress today, This is the equivalent around 1900. This is made of a very, very fine linen, white linen, perhaps some cotton in here as well. And it has many of these embellished panels, but they are sheer. This would have been worn over a very light chemise, a white chemise, but this was meant to be extremely breathable, extremely light, and meant to be enjoyed when you went to things like a lawn party, or if you went for a stroll through a park, one of the newly established United States national parks, perhaps. This would have been worn by a young lady, again, around 1905, and it would have been worn with gloves, white lace gloves, as well as a large sun hat that may have matched. It probably had many ribbons and flower embellishments, as well as a parasol. And that was all for protection from the sun. All of those pieces together were meant to be very, very protective. Sunscreens were not readily available at that point in time, so this was the easiest way to protect your skin. But all of them were made from extremely lightweight materials. Linens and cottons especially were extremely, and still are today, extremely breathable and allow for a lot of airflow. So it makes for an extremely comfortable gown to be wearing in the height of summer. So I want to thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, please do pop them in the comments. We are happy to go back into our Tuesday Treasures and answer some of those. I remind you to please look on our Instagram for some of the close-ups of these materials. If you'd like to be able to read the name on our football uniform or some of the details on the pattern, please join us there. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that we will see you at the museum again very, very soon. Thank you so much.